I feel like this makeup is giving Rocky Horror Show and like not in a good way.
Well, hey there, it's great to see you. If this is your first time here, my name is Brooke and I enjoy researching strange occurrences, true crime, conspiracy theories, and sharing these stories with you. If you're not new here, then welcome back. A special shout out to this lovely commenter who recommended today's case, and if you have any topics that you'd like me to cover in the future, then go ahead and leave those down below in the comments and I will get to them as soon as I can. American Horror Story. It's been so long since I've actually sat down and finished an entire season, but Murder House through Freak Show had me in an absolute chokehold back in the day, let me tell you. If you were or are a fan of AHS, then let me know down below what your favorite season was. I think I have to stay with the original and say Murder House. But if you said Coven, then you may enjoy learning about the historical truth behind Kathy Bates' character, Madame Lalaurie. In the season, Madame Lalaurie is depicted as a wealthy Creole socialite in the heart of New Orleans whose name became synonymous with cruelty and horror. She broke the already extremely outrageous laws by today's standards concerning human slavery in the early 19th century. On top of the outright physical and mental abuse that she subjected her slaves to in the show, she was also depicted forcing her daughters to participate in the violent acts against the slaves, using slaves' blood as a facial treatment to keep her young, and it also showed that she died from drinking poison, which she was led to believe was a youth potion. The real-life Madame Lalaurie was an atrocious murderer and overall an awful person, but spoiler alert, her story isn't exactly as sensationalized as pop culture has made it out to be. But don't fret, if you're interested and would like to hear the true story behind the woman who inspired Kathy Bates' heinous character, then stick around and we'll jump right into it. Marie Delphine McCarty was born March 19th, 1786 amidst the Spanish colonial rule in New Orleans, which at the time was property of Spain and therefore known as Spanish Louisiana. Around 1730, her grandfather Bartholomew McCarty had rounded up his children and immigrated to Spanish Louisiana from Ireland. Many of his descendants became military men and earned enough money to own land, which classified them as elite Creole gentlemen. One of them was the governor of Spanish Louisiana and Florida, and another was the mayor of New Orleans. Among these men was Delphine's father, Louis. Louis Bartholomew de McCarty was knighted as the Chevalier of Royalty and Military Order of St. Louis. In 1763, he met and married Marie Gianna Leabre, who was born and raised in New Orleans. Her love for entertaining made her well known in the community as well, since one of her favorite things in the world was hosting house parties, which anybody who was anybody would be sure to attend. Her extravagant parties were known to last well into the morning hours and to get pretty crazy. These two went on to create an additional 5 members for their family unit, one of them being Delphine. In 1791, when Delphine was only 4 years old, the Haitian Revolution began. It was a rebellion of the slaves that led to their liberation in modern-day Haiti, and it really sparked fear in Spanish Americans who feared that their slaves would follow suit. The revolution hit really close to home for the McCarty family too. Delphine's uncle had been killed by one of his own slaves only years prior. The murder actually inspired 3 slave revolts, including the German Coast Uprising, Mina Conspiracy, and the Point Coupe Conspiracy. By age 8, Delphine's parents had acquired a 1,344-acre plantation in New Orleans. It's safe to say that they were living lavishly. In 1800, like many other young girls in early history, unfortunately, 14-year-old Delphine married a 35-year-old grown man. Don Ramon de Lopez y Angulo was a Spanish royal officer, but he wasn't fond of working under the crown. Years prior, they had ordered him to relocate from Spain to Spanish Louisiana. He had insisted on waiting another month to make the voyage, but the crown was not having any of his concerns. They demanded that Don and his first wife set sail during the worst time of the year for sailing, so much so that Don's wife didn't survive the trip. The loss of his wife really made him resent the crown for forcing him to set sail early despite his pleas, and he began acting out against their orders. Specifically, he started importing African slaves even though it was explicitly prohibited against the Spanish rule. The crown ended up demoting him from his position as a royal officer and started making him travel very often as punishment. While deployed off of the coast of Cuba, Don Ramon met 14-year-old Delphine. As the two got to know each other better, Don began explaining his current work situation and how he had been punished after the difficult loss of his wife. Although Delphine was only a teenager, she used her family's influence in the community to speak with the Queen on Don's behalf. It actually worked out, and he was promoted to the Spanish consul of Louisiana. The two ended up getting married after only 5 months of dating. Before one of Don's travels to Madrid for court duties in 1804, he and a very pregnant Delphine had planned to reunite in Havana after the completion of his duties and then set sail back home to New Orleans together. Tragically though, Don would never make it back to Havana after his ship hit a sandbar near the coast and killed him. Delphine gave birth to their daughter just a few days later, and the two returned to New Orleans with one less family member than they had planned. By this time, Delphine's hometown was no longer under Spanish or French rule since the Louisiana Purchase had occurred. 3 years later, in 1807, Delphine's mother Marie passed away. After her death, she had willed 1/3 of her estate to Delphine, which included $33,000, the family plantation, 52 slaves, livestock, and farming equipment. The total value of this estate would equal about $2 million today. Her father went on to start a relationship and have a child with Sophie Musante, who was actually a quarter black. This was actually extremely common among wealthy Creole men, so much so that it in fact has a name. Placage. Placage has been described as the, quote, inhabitants of New Orleans being unusually open about interracial relationships, unquote. White men often held non-legal, left-handed marriages with women of mixed race who were either free or enslaved. If the woman was enslaved, her husband, who had usually either been married before or was using her as a placeholder, would free her. Sometimes the men would go on to marry another woman, or they would have families within their left-handed marriages and remain a lifelong family. The McCarty men were no exception to this common practice. Delphine's uncle Eugene had a similar relationship, which resulted in 7 children, and her cousins and associates did the same. At 20 years old, Delphine meets and marries banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator Jean-Paul Blanc in 1807. The couple bought what they would call Villa Blanc at 409 Royal Street in New Orleans and would split their time between the villa and their plantation. Life appeared to be going pretty great for the couple, and they ended up welcoming 3 daughters and 1 son to the world over the next several years. They actually all had very similar names: Marie-Louise Pauline, Marie-Louise Gianna, Louise-Marie Laurie, and Jean-Pierre Paulin Blanc. I can only assume they wanted to ensure that their legacy was widely known and expanded upon. Jean died in 1816, leaving Delphine a single mother of 5. Not only did 28-year-old Delphine just suddenly become a widow and a single parent, but she found out that her widower had been hiding $160,000 worth of debt, which by today's standards is about $2.5 million. I can't even imagine how upset, rageful, vengeful she was, or at least how I would be, because imagine losing your husband, being a single mother, and then finding out that you're $2.5 million in debt, which wasn't even yours. It's just yours by default. Infuriating. Desperate to keep her personal items and some of her wealth for her and her children's sake, Delphine sold Jean's properties, his slaves, and forfeited their mutual assets to the courts. Around the same time, 8 of her own slaves died within 5 years. In some archived letters between family members, Delphine was described as having the luck of the Irish from her grandfather, since not long after her financial struggles began, her father left her $5,000 and 2 slaves upon his death, just to, lessen the blow of becoming a widow. The following year, in June of 1825, it seems that fate would strike yet again when Delphine brought her son to the local chiropractor, Leonard Louis Nicolas Lalaurie. Dr. Lalaurie was a Frenchman who was 15 years her junior, but Delphine was pretty quickly smitten with him. From his perspective, Delphine was an older woman who had a decent amount of money despite what he considered to be pitfalls. For example, her 2 previous marriages and the fact that she was the single mother of 5 children. His father had also recently written him a letter encouraging his son to marry Delphine since she was a wealthy older woman who could potentially help him further his career as a doctor. So when Delphine soon found out that she was pregnant, Dr. Lalaurie said, "What the heck? I guess we can be together." They tried to get married as soon as possible before the baby was born, since they were both Catholic and it was considered sinful to have a child out of wedlock, but they had to wait 5 months. They were eventually married on January 12th, 1828. Luckily, Delphine wasn't completely blinded by love and kept her wits about by making Dr. Lalaurie sign a prenup. After all, he had only brought $2,000 worth of assets into the marriage, and she had brought $66,000, and she wanted to keep what was rightfully hers in the event of a divorce. Many people who knew the couple claim that Dr. Lalaurie wasn't around much during the marriage, off doing who knows what. But when the couple was together, they broke up and got together repeatedly. It was not a smooth or easy marriage whatsoever. In addition to her extremely rocky marriage, Delphine was also feeling a little bit insecure about her body, especially since she was older than her husband and compared herself to women who were closer to his age. In 1840, Delphine bought land and built a mansion at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter. The mansion was complete with slave quarters in the attic, which was unfortunately the norm for the wealthy at this time. Delphine lived in the residence with her husband and 2 daughters, and they continued living their high society lifestyle. In public, Delphine appeared to be polite to Black people, and she acted as if she had an ounce of compassion for slaves, even going as far as freeing 2 of her own in 1819 and in 1832. And that was a lot more than could be said for most people then, but still horrible. Especially considering what truth Delphine was hiding behind this facade. When Delphine wasn't pretending to be kind, she could sometimes have violent mood swings, which led a lot of people to believe that she was mentally ill. People around the community started noticing that her slaves looked very beat up, even more beat up than slaves normally were. There were laws that prohibited extreme physical violence against slaves to a certain degree, which is just awful to think about. But most people said that it appeared like Delphine was breaking those laws by far. With word of these abusive conditions circulating, a local lawyer decided to pay a visit to the Lalaurie mansion. Though after conducting a wellness check, he found no evidence of any wrongdoing in the household. Still, rumors escalated by the day. Word around town was that Delphine kept her cook chained to the stove and would beat her daughters if they even attempted to try and sneak any food to this starving slave. Other rumors said that she kept slaves for Dr. Lalaurie specifically for the purpose of practicing Haitian voodoo medicine. While there were a lot of rumors flying around, there were 2 things for sure. One male slave had jumped from the mansion's 2nd-story window rather than be tortured to death by Delphine. Another account from a neighbor was that they witnessed an 8-year-old girl fall from the roof of the mansion while trying to escape being whipped by Madame Lalaurie. Later that night, they saw Delphine carrying the young girl's lifeless body to the backyard and burying it. The neighbor reported this blatant disregard for human life, to which police prompted an investigation into the Lalaurie mansion. Delphine's daughter later detailed that the 8-year-old girl was actually a 12-year-old named Leah who had been brushing Delphine's hair and accidentally snagged it with the hairbrush before being chased around the house with a whip. While she was trying to escape being bloodied, she fell out the window to a horrible, horrible death. Delphine was found guilty of cruelty by the courts and ordered to pay a fine of $300, along with the forfeiture of 9 slaves. Not much later, though, those 9 slaves were returned to the mansion by a close relative. Over the next few years, 12 slaves were reported to have died at the Lalaurie mansion. Now, that's not taking into account any deaths that were caused by disease, but it's also not taking into account any other deaths that were covered up in the backyard, so we don't even really know. One of those 12 reported deaths included Delphine's cook and laundry woman, Bon. It's unclear exactly how, but Bon tragically died in the mansion along with her 4 children, who ranged in ages between 4 and 13. In November 1832, Delphine filed for separation from Dr. Lalaurie, citing poor treatment and detailing an event where he physically abused her, which was supported by 3 of their children who witnessed it. Dr. Lalaurie moved out 5 months later, but apparently still returned regularly since he was present during this next part of the story. On April 10th, 1834, a fire started in the Lalaurie mansion kitchen and began spreading quickly. Neighbors took notice of the fire and quickly banded together, attempting to go inside and help move their precious belongings to safety before the fire claimed them, and to ensure that everyone inside the house was evacuated. However, Delphine refused to give them the keys to the house. Neighbor and local judge Jean-Francois walked over to the scene of the fire and asked Dr. Lalaurie to have the slaves rescued, since it was clear that Delphine was refusing to hand over the keys. To this extremely reasonable request, the doctor insisted that Jean stay home instead of judging what goes on in other people's houses. Despite the very rude attitude that he was met with, Judge Jean ordered that the townspeople break down the door to the mansion and rescue the poor victims that were left trapped inside. The citizens who went inside the mansion had to have at least partially mentally prepared to see some of the damage done to these people from the fire, but what they found was even more horrific than they ever could have imagined. Inside, they found 7 slaves that were suspended from the rafters by their necks, with their limbs being stretched and torn in unimaginable ways. They were completely mutilated beyond belief, emaciated, scarred, and even some wearing spiked collars so that they couldn't move their heads whatsoever. The slaves claimed to have been kept in these conditions for months. Judge Jean would later testify in court that he witnessed a woman in the attic wearing an iron collar and an older woman with a major head wound who could barely walk. This is the part of the story that, as it's perpetuated in pop culture, is embellished and exaggerated over time, and it seems like a lot of people use these unspeakable acts as sort of a Mad Libs for their creative writing hobby, and it's a little weird in my opinion. You know, telephone does happen, but some of the things are just like, why did you feel the need to take it even that much further than it already was? I don't know. I digress. I'm not going to include the detailed, gory descriptions of these alleged reports, but I will say that a few of them included turning someone into a crab shape or a caterpillar shape. I don't even really know if I can visualize what that would look like, and I don't think that I want to, but the details are pretty widely available on the internet if curiosity is really getting to you and you must know. When the townspeople found out about what Delphine was subjecting her slaves to, and then they realized that despite calling the police with no immediate response, they decided to take matters into their own hands and form an angry mob. In addition to the damage that the fire had done to the mansion, the mob almost completely demolished the home, leaving only a few walls standing. When police and the fire department finally arrived, they found a 70-year-old cook chained to the stove, and luckily she was still alive. She told police that she was the one who started the fire and that she had actually done it because she would rather die in a fire by suicide rather than face any more punishment at the hands of Delphine. She told police how she had watched countless slaves be taken upstairs to the quarters by Delphine and never came back down. Upon further investigation of the scene, police dug up the yard and found 2 bodies buried, one of them being 12-year-old Leah. Police ended up taking the slaves to jail for public viewing, where 2 of them later died and over 4,000 townspeople came to look at them. I think that it's ironic that everyone was so worried about the condition of the slaves when they were gossiping about Delphine and her cruelty and the fire, but when it actually came time to do the right thing, they just went and viewed them as if they were some sort of exhibit. Very gross, very disgusting. Back during the angry mob that broke out while the mansion was on fire, Delphine and 3 of her children fled from New Orleans with the help of a loyal enslaved chauffeur who loaded them into their horse-drawn carriage. The mob tried their best to stop the horses from leaving and even tried to rip Delphine out of the carriage to prevent her from going, but they ended up getting away anyways. After fleeing, Delphine left her mansion to be handled by an agent who sold it for only half of its purchase price. The agent also sold 11 of Delphine's 30 slaves, including the loyal driver who had helped her escape because apparently she couldn't be bothered to free him after she ran off. It's also very suspicious that 19 of her slaves were unaccounted for, because if they had been sold previously before the fire, there would almost certainly be paperwork to back up these transactions. I think this points towards more hidden instances of Delphine torturing and burying slaves away in her backyard to avoid being caught. Delphine and Dr. Lalaurie took their 3 children to Alabama, then to New York, and finally off to Paris. Even though Delphine had legally filed for separation and the 2 were living apart from one another, Dr. Lalaurie decided that he would take this time to really suck the well dry for a while. He, Delphine, and their children continued to live in expensive neighborhoods and carry on with their highbrow lifestyles as normal. But since Delphine had relinquished the responsibilities of her businesses to her son-in-law when she fled, she actually didn't have all of this money that she was spending. She was racking up the credit cards to fill a void, and once Dr. Lalaurie realized that this life of luxury was quickly coming to a close, he just as quickly headed back to live in Havana, Cuba. In 1842, Delphine's son wrote a letter to a relative saying that his mother wanted to return to New Orleans in order to straighten out her business. When any of her family members told her that she was out of her mind for even thinking of showing her face around New Orleans, she claimed that she hadn't left for any particular reason, implying that she still did not think that she had done anything wrong. Right, you left the country for no reason at all. Just so happened to flee the country at that exact moment. Right. Delphine never did end up returning to New Orleans. One of her other sons, Jean Bose, said that she had been brought to court for the mistreatment of slaves years prior to the fire, but since her accusers were too terrified to testify in court, she was let go free. The family was accustomed to referring to the fire as the catastrophe of 1834. I think it was a little more than a catastrophe that happened. I know that word holds a lot of weight, but it almost makes it seem as if what happened was an accident. Like, ma'am, you refused to have your slaves rescued from burning to death, and then you got exposed for being a cruel POS and then ran away. That sounds like a heavily punishable offense rather than just an oopsie. My bad. After living in Paris for about 15 years, yet another rumor followed Madame Lalaurie when it was widely believed that she died in a boar hunting accident. However, there were several letters written between her children around that time which detailed the health issues that she was suffering. Additionally, Paris archives showed that she died at home in 1849 and was interred in a family tomb before being exhumed and placed in yet another family tomb in New Orleans. The famously haunted Lalaurie mansion that is commonly visited today in the French Quarter was rebuilt in 1838 and has since been repurposed as a high school, a music conservatory, apartment building, youth shelter, bar, and a furniture store. It has undergone many renovations over the centuries, adding stories and meticulous artistic details. In April 2007, actor Nicolas Cage actually purchased the mansion for $3.45 million. The home underwent foreclosure only 2 years later in 2009 and was last purchased in 2010 for $2.1 million. Madame Lalaurie's mansion and her story have evolved over a 200 200-year period, emphasizing what an awful human being she was. Most of the pop culture depictions of this woman are exaggerated for entertainment value, telling stories of hundreds of slaves being tortured single-handedly. Was what she did not horrible enough or entertaining enough? Like, it's so weird to me that people just continue to embellish these stories, but once again, I digress. Anyways, I really enjoyed researching this week's case. It was definitely informative learning about true crime in an older time period, and I feel like I got a little bit of a history refresher along with some new things that I'd never even heard of. I hope you enjoyed this week's video as well, and if you did, please consider hitting that subscribe button so that you can see me back here every single Monday. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in the next one. Bye!